So, Glenn Beck went on the Tucker Carlson show recently and said that Jesus told his disciples that they were living in the end times, and he gave them a bunch of signs of his return, and that it didn't happen the way Jesus said it would happen, that Jesus was confused. He said that the apostles were confused because they expected Jesus to return in their lifetime. And if you're anything like me, that really is going to bother you, because you want to be able to trust Jesus, and you do trust Jesus, but Glenn Beck is right. Jesus did say that all the signs in Matthew 24 would take place in that generation. So that's a problem. Now maybe you're going to say, we can't listen to Glenn Beck because he's Mormon, which is true. Are you aware that C.S. Lewis called Matthew 24:34 the verse where Jesus said all those things would take place in that generation 2,000 years ago? C.S. Lewis called that verse the most embarrassing verse in the Bible, and he recognized that critics of the Bible were using that verse against Christians, and he didn't have a way to answer them. But I'm going to argue that what if there's an option where we don't have to twist the words of Jesus? We don't have to say, oh, Jesus didn't really mean this generation. What if the problem isn't that Jesus was confused? What if the problem isn't that the disciples were confused? What if we've been confused? What if the problem isn't with them, it's with us and our interpretation of what Jesus said? So I just want to make the quickest video possible. I'm going to make it as short as I can. It's going to be hard, but I want you to hang with me, because I would like to demonstrate to you that all the signs, all the things that Jesus talked about in Matthew 24, the earthquakes, the famines, the false prophets, the signs in the sun, moon, and stars, the Son of Man coming on the clouds, everything. What if I could demonstrate to you that that all happened in the lifetime of the disciples in the first century, exactly like Jesus said? I know it sounds crazy and it sounds like an impossible task, but if you'll hang with me, I'm going to try to do it really quick. And according to YouTube Studio, the average viewer only watches 2 minutes and 30 seconds, which I'm already up to 3 minutes, so you've probably already hung up. But for those of you left, let's try this. Okay, let's remember the context of Matthew 24. Remember, Jesus was talking to the Pharisees, and he said, behold, your house is left to you desolate. He's talking about the temple. He's talking about the destruction of the temple. And the disciples said, when is this going to happen? What's going to be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Okay, so remember, Jesus also said not one stone would be left upon another. He's talking about the destruction of the temple. So that brings us to our first sign. Not one stone left upon another. This is really interesting. I didn't know this because my history teacher never told me about this, but 40 years after Jesus was crucified, Rome destroyed Jerusalem, burned the temple. The gold melted, all the precious metals melted, and they flowed down into the crevices and the cracks of the rocks. And so Titus came in with his soldiers, and they literally dug up the entire temple, foundation, city, everything. They plowed it like a field, actually, which is exactly what Micah predicted. Jerusalem will be plowed like a field. So let's do this. Check. Okay, next. False Christs. Okay, 1 John 4:1 says, many false prophets have gone out into the world. these were the false Christs. Christ means Messiah, Savior. There were many people claiming to be the Savior during this war with Rome. One of them, Simon Bar Joria, if you want to read about him, you can read about him in Josephus, called King. Many, many false Christs. Okay, this is interesting. Wars and rumors of wars. Okay, I think you can read about this or listen to Bruce Gore talks about an interesting fact that when Jesus told his disciples all these things, they were living actually in a time of peace. It was during the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. So there weren't really a lot of wars or rumors and wars, which makes what Jesus said kind of interesting. I mean, if we're going to say it now, I mean, people have been talking about wars ever since I was born, so it wouldn't really mean much to me, but it meant something to them. There was turmoil within Israel itself, specifically after Jesus ascended, because the zealots, they started to rebel against Rome, and they wanted all the Jews to be on their side. They ended up having a civil war within their own country, basically murdering each other. So yeah, there were a lot of wars and rumors of wars in the decades after Jesus. So check. Famines and earthquakes. You can just read about these in the Bible. You don't have to go anywhere else. Acts 11, there was a famine of the known world, and other books of the New Testament, Romans, 1 Corinthians, they're discussing how the Christians were providing relief from these famines. We also have earthquakes mentioned in Matthew and Acts. In fact, earthquakes occurred in Crete, Rome, Phrygia, Laodicea, Campania, Pompeii. Anyone heard of Pompeii? And Judea. So famines and earthquakes, check. All right. Deliver you up to tribulation, put you to death, you'll be hated by all nations. Remember, he's going to deliver you up. You will be put to death. This isn't me, you, or you. This was them, you. There's a context. There's some audience relevance to think about here. He's not talking to us. And that was fulfilled in the first century. The apostles were arrested, flogged, stoned, dragged from homes, put in prison, and put to death. So, check. Moving right along. Many will fall away, betray one another, and hate one another. Okay. You can read about that all through the New Testament. It actually has a name. It's called the little apostasy. And that means the little falling away. I don't know why they call it little, because it wasn't little. I think it was pretty intense. And it's mentioned in Acts, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, 2 Peter, 1 John. I mean, you understand what I'm saying. The New Testament actually talks about this happening. False brothers. And Paul even says in 2 Timothy that he had been deserted by everyone. So, falling away, betrayal, yes. False prophets. Okay, 1 John 4:1, many false prophets have gone out. Check. This is a good one, lawlessness. We like to apply that to us today, but yet again, let's remember who this was written to. And we can read about this lawlessness in the New Testament. You'll find incest, prostitution, fornication, and kidnapping. And then, a lot of people like to point out the lawlessness of Rome under, say, Caligula or Nero. And, I'd point out that the Jews themselves became incredibly lawless toward the end of this war with Rome. One story, if you want to read about it in Josephus, has them dressing in women's clothing and parading through the city of Jerusalem and raping and murdering. So it seems pretty lawless. So check. Okay, this is a good one. Gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed to the whole world. Okay? The whole world. Now you're going to say to me, that didn't happen. People tell me this all the time. That's what I thought too. Let's look at the word here. The whole world. Oikumene. Okay? Oikumene. That doesn't mean the whole world as we think of it today. It doesn't mean Australia. It doesn't mean South America. It doesn't mean China. Let's hang with me. I know you're going to have trouble accepting this, but the word oikumene meant the known inhabited world, which at that time was the Roman Empire. And I can prove it to you because in Luke 2:1, anybody know what happened in Luke chapter 2? This is a quiz. Well, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the oikumene, the world. He wasn't counting people in South America, okay? So the gospel had to be proclaimed to the Roman Empire, the whole world of their day. Same word. And I'm going to prove it that it was, okay? Romans 1:8 says the gospel has been proclaimed throughout the whole world. Colossians 1:6, in all the world. Colossians 1:23, in all creation under heaven. Romans 16:26, to all nations. And 1 Timothy 3:16, it has been believed on in the world. So the New Testament writers state emphatically that the gospel had been proclaimed to the whole world. It was the whole Roman Empire. Okay, check. Surprising one there, but okay, here we come to another one. Abomination of desolation. Oh, standing in the holy place. Okay, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, you know, you got me with that whole world thing, but you're not going to get me with the abomination of desolation because there's no way. Well, okay, let's look to the Bible for this. Luke, he also records the Olivet Discourse in his gospel. It's a parallel account. And instead of referring to the abomination of desolation, he calls it Jerusalem surrounded by armies. So Luke is telling you when this is going to happen. It's going to happen when Jerusalem is surrounded by armies. And that did happen in the first century. 5 months before Jerusalem fell, there was a siege. The Romans completely surrounded them. So also, if we really want to go, oh, say hi to my husband. He's taking trash out. Poor guy. So Daniel 11 talks about this abomination, and he talks about it as being when counterfeit worship is set up in the temple. Now let me tell you about this. Super interesting story, and I hate to spend so much time on this one because I know we're trying to go fast, but Josephus records that during the war with Rome, the Jews, they murdered the high priests. They just killed them. And then they cast lots, and they picked a guy, random guy, to be the high priest, and his name was Phanes, I think. And he was just what we'd call like a hillbilly in our day. I mean, they basically, I think it says they like dragged him out of the field and they dressed him up in the garments of the high priest, and they put the turban on his head and they put the ephod on him, and then they got drunk and they sat around and laughed, and they told him how to pretend to do all the duties of the high priest, and it was a total defamation of the sanctuary and the Holy of Holies. And it says the priests who were left, who actually revered the law, they were just completely devastated about this. So I'm going to suggest to you that that was the abomination that was set up in the temple. And also, you know, another way to think about this abomination is a rejection of the ultimate sacrifice of Christ in favor of the old covenant sacrificial system. That was an abomination to God. And in fact, the Old Testament talks about how someday your sacrifices will be an abomination to me. Why is that? It's because they rejected the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus. So, I feel like I did it. Abomination of desolation, standing in the holy place. Check. Flee to the mountains. First of all, this is a representative of a local judgment. I live in Indiana, so I'm not going to be fleeing to the mountains, okay? Let's think back to Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember Lot? What did he do? He fled to the mountains. It wasn't the whole world. It was a local judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's the same thing here. Judea. They fled to the mountains of Judea. So flee to the mountains. Check. And they did. Okay, what do we have here? If you are on your housetop, don't go down and take what is in your house. If you're in the field, don't go back for your cloak. Pray that your flight is in winter, not in winter or on the Sabbath. Okay. Not a lot of people hanging out on their housetop right now, but back in their time, that was how they did it. I don't know about you, I don't wear a cloak. So field work, Sabbath laws, like all these things represent and demonstrate that Jesus was giving signs to them. And remember, it says right here, if you are on the housetop, not me, not you, it's them. Okay. Check. Okay, here we go. We're going to have a great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now and never will be again. Okay? Luke, let's go to Luke, parallel account, so we can figure out what, maybe get some more interpretation on this. Luke calls it a time of great distress, great tribulation, time of great distress on the land, right? Land, Greek word gi, meaning land of Israel, okay? And he calls it wrath on this people. That's interesting, isn't it? Not this, not us, this, them, this people, the Jews. It was wrath on the Jews. And if you think that the tribulation that the Jews went through during their war with each other and with Rome, if you think that wasn't all that terrible, I would highly recommend that you read some of Josephus's accounts of that war, and Charles Spurgeon, kind of like a highly regarded guy. He says the destruction of Jerusalem was more terrible than anything the world has ever witnessed, either before or since. I mean, sounds pretty bad. And then we have Titus. So he's the general that actually was in charge of the war, and he was horrified. He said, basically he didn't want credit for it. He said, you know what, Jews, your gods did this to you. It wasn't me, because it was really even worse than he could have imagined it. So, okay, great tribulation. Check. Oh, and let me remind you, John in Revelation says he's their fellow sufferer with them in the tribulation. So you can think about that a little. Okay, we're getting a few more to go, guys. Hang with me. Days cut short, or all flesh would perish. Okay, all flesh, we think that means the whole world, but it meant all flesh of Israel, Judea. And I'm going to suggest that maybe you should go back to the Old Testament and read Jeremiah 12:12. And also think about Acts chapter 2, when they're given the Holy Spirit, and they're speaking in tongues. And Peter says, hey guys, listen, we're not drunk, but this is what Joel prophesied when the Lord said, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. It wasn't like every single person in the whole world was prophesying and dreaming dreams. It was sons, daughters, young, old, like all types of people. So all flesh, let's re-examine that. Local. Okay. False Christs and false prophets. I mean, there's just so many of these in the New Testament. We've already talked about 1 John, talks about false prophets. There was even one towards the end of the Jewish war with Rome that he told everybody, hey, you need to run up, get up on top of the temple, and then the Lord's going to come down and he's going to save you. And they believed him, and then they died. So, also we have Simon the Sorcerer mentioned in the book of Acts. There's just a lot of these mentioned in the Bible, so check. Okay. He says he will come like lightning. Okay. First of all, lightning is local. Let's keep that in mind. And it's used in Scripture, in the Old Testament, to signify God's terrifying presence, okay? You can read about that in Psalms, 2 Samuel, and Ezekiel, okay? Also, I mean, if you want to have like an actual physical fulfillment of this, which I don't think the text demands, but I'll give it to you. You can read in Josephus about this storm that came on Jerusalem during the siege that was like, they said it was the worst storm they had ever experienced, nothing like it before, and it scared the living daylights out of it, not just the Jews, but the Romans too. So, lightning. Okay, he talks about corpses and vultures eating the corpses. Okay. In Jeremiah, again, it says that those who violate God's covenant will be, their dead bodies will be food for the birds. So this is just another way to say judgment is coming on you, okay? And it did. And there were a bunch of dead bodies piled up everywhere in the first century in Jerusalem, just like Jesus said. Check. Okay, this is going to be a good one. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, stars will fall from heaven, powers of the heavens shaken. Oh boy, here's where you're going to say, there's no way this happened. There is no way. I mean, let's just think about this anyway. If the stars fell from the sky, which is what, they used to show us these like scary movies, or maybe the Jehovah's Witnesses showed me this. I don't know. It's like stars falling onto the earth. But, they say stars are bigger than the earth, so I always kind of thought, how would that even work? But, but I'm going to suggest to you that we have taken this language completely out of context, and that the Hebrews used idioms, okay? Just like we say, it's raining cats and dogs. We don't think it's actually raining cats and dogs. We know what that means. And when they talked about signs in the sun, moon, and stars, it meant to them that a kingdom was being overthrown, okay? The sun and the moon and the stars represented the king, its rulers, and then the people. And you can read about this. There's so many examples. For example, Isaiah 13 says, in talking about judgment on Babylon, okay, so God's judging Babylon, and he says, the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be dark at its rising. The moon will not shed its light. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? So I think I have a lot of scriptural support. I mean, it's Isaiah 13, 24, 34, Ezekiel 32, Joel 2 and 3, and Habakkuk 3, okay? Those are just some of the places you can read about where the sun, moon, and stars are used figuratively to represent nations. And, just to make it even more clear, let's go back to Joseph's dream. Remember Joseph's dream? He said, oh, hey, Dad, I had this dream, and the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. And you know what? His dad said, what in the world? Do you honestly think that me and your mother and your brothers are going to bow down to you? See how he instantly, automatically knew what Joseph's dream was about? No one had to interpret that for him. It was their common vernacular. So, sun darkened, signs in the heavens, we'll just call it that. Check. Just have to reevaluate how we've thought about these things. This is what I'm saying. Maybe Jesus wasn't wrong. Maybe the apostles weren't wrong. Maybe I was wrong. Okay, another good one here. Sign of the Son of Man, all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and you will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. Okay. So, this is where people are like, okay, this is the second coming, and I agree. Remember, this is what the apostles asked about. What will be the sign of your coming, right? And now he's saying, here, I'm coming. All the earth's mourning. The Son of Man's coming on the clouds. Okay, well, again, let's go back to the Old Testament. What does it mean when the Lord rides on a cloud, or the Son of Man? I mean, is he like a Care Bear? You know, that's kind of, I mean, honestly, that's how I pictured it. You've got like this big puffy white cloud, and Jesus is like riding on it, you know? Let's look at Isaiah chapter 19. It says, behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt. This was judgment on Egypt. So coming on the clouds in the Old Testament always represented judgment on a nation. And so why would we try to make it mean something else in the New Testament? The apostles knew what this meant. It meant Jesus was coming in judgment. And remember, the whole topic of this discourse is the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. Isn't that a judgment? So, okay, coming on the clouds. Check. We're almost done, guys. I know, it's been long, but I mean, if you're like me, the first time I heard some of this stuff, it just blew my mind. So, he's going to send out his angels with a loud trumpet call to gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Gary DeMar says the four winds and one end of heaven to the other, those are symbolic metaphors referring to the land of Israel. We're still local here, okay? Like, we're not suddenly switching to global, okay? The context of Matthew 24 is local from beginning to end, okay? And trumpet, okay, we have a trumpet here. At the great trumpet, those who are perishing in the land of Assyria and Egypt will come and worship the Lord on his holy mountain. That's Isaiah 27. This trumpet is the gathering of believers to worship at God's holy mountain. And remember what is said in the book of Hebrews. He tells them, you have come to Mount Zion, right? The heavenly Jerusalem. This isn't a physical gathering. It's a spiritual gathering. It wasn't a physical mountain they had been gathered to. It just reminds me of the woman at the well. And she said, well, you know, my people believe we need to worship at this mountain, and your people say it has to be in Jerusalem. And Jesus said, a time is coming when the true worshipers will worship me in spirit and in truth. It's not physical. So, also, when we think about gathering, one last thought here really quick. Remember, keeping in context, what did Jesus tell the Pharisees in Matthew 23 right before he told them that their temple was going to be destroyed and not one stone would be left on another? He said, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I have longed to gather you like a mother hen gathers her chicks, but you were not willing. Okay? It's a spiritual gathering. Okay. So, check. Oh, I even hate to bring this one up. When you see the fig tree has leaves, then know that summer is near. I've had a lot of people blowing up my comment section on my last video about Israel and 1948 is the fig tree, and it proves that Jesus is coming back in this generation, and he didn't mean that generation, he means this generation, and wow. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, for one thing, generation keeps getting longer and longer. You know, it used to be 40 years, and it was 70 years, and it's like 80 years, and, you know. But if we look, okay, let's look at Luke's account, parallel account, talking about the same thing. He says the fig tree and all the other trees. He's not just talking about a fig tree. So how would they apply that to their, theory that Israel in 1948 is the fig tree? It wouldn't make sense because Luke talks about all the trees. I'm going to suggest to you that we don't have to overthink this. Jesus was just using an example from nature. When you see, we know what that means in the spring when the trees get leaves. I know that summer is near when the trees here, like right now, they're starting to lose their leaves. I know it's going to get cold, okay? So, also, keep in mind, he said, when you see all these things, here we go again, you, I challenge you, to just count all the yous in the Olivet Discourse. There's a lot of yous, okay? And this one is really cool because I want to think about this. He says, when you see all the things, then you know that he is near and at the very gates. Okay, so when you see all the signs, not just some of the signs, when you see all the signs, then you know that he is near and at the very gates. Okay, I'm going to ask you to think about something with me for 1 minute. James, the apostle, Jesus' brother, in James chapter 5 says, the Lord is near at the very door or gate. Okay, Jesus said, when you see all the signs, know that it's near and at the door. James said, the Lord is near and at the door. What does that mean? It's pretty simple here, guys. It means James saw all the signs. All the things that we've been talking about, like the gospel being preached to the world and the abomination of desolation and all the things that I'm saying, and the fig tree, that you think I'm crazy, well, you're going to have to say that James was crazy too because he saw all the signs, okay? So I'm putting a check here. Check. Okay. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Yep, generation means generation, this means this. And a generation from the Bible, I'm just going to tell you, is 40 years because read the book of Exodus. It says they wandered for 40 years until that generation was gone. So the biblical definition of a generation is 40 years. So, check. And this is the last one. I'm sorry this is so long. I bet like 99.9% of you have already hung up, but okay. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Okay, this is going to be the last big reformation in your thinking, if you're willing to entertain this idea with me. But what if heaven and earth didn't have anything to do with the end of the world? What if heaven and earth meant something different to them? What if it was one of those idioms or Hebraic figures of speech that I was talking about earlier? What if it represented the old covenant age? Okay, I'm going to give you a couple things to think about here. Jeremiah 4, okay? Jeremiah 4, He's speaking of Judah's desolation, okay? And he says, I looked on the earth, and behold, it was without form and void, and to the heavens, and they had no light. So here he's speaking of heaven and earth in context of destruction of Judah. Haggai chapter 2 says, I am about to shake the heavens and the earth and to overthrow the kingdoms. Okay? And there's other examples. So I'm going to suggest to you that heavens and earth was a metaphor that was common in Hebraic thought that represented to them a kingdom. Okay? And let's just think about the kingdom of Israel, Old Covenant Israel. Their whole nation was built around God dwelling with them. They built this tabernacle in the wilderness, and they built this ark, and they put it in the inner part of the tabernacle, and God said, I will dwell with you there, my presence will be there. And then he came and he dwelled between the cherubim on the ark, and when Moses would go in, his face would shine because he had been in the presence of God. Heaven, where God dwells, earth, where man dwells. Heaven and earth is the temple and Jerusalem. It's the old covenant system that allowed God to dwell with man. Okay? So when Jesus says, and this is the really cool thing about this, when Jesus says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away, he didn't change topic. Remember, let's go back. What was the topic? Destruction of Jerusalem. What's the last thing he says? Heaven and earth will pass away. See how consistent he is? He didn't suddenly talk about a whole new topic. It's the same topic, okay? So what I'm saying to you here, which I know is hard, okay? I know it's very different than what we've been taught, but it's the only view that makes consistent sense of Jesus's words and doesn't make us have to try to change the meaning of what Jesus said to fit our beliefs, okay? We have to fit our beliefs into what Jesus said. So when heaven and earth passed away in that generation, that was the end of the old covenant. And that was demonstrated by the fact that Rome came and they completely destroyed Jerusalem, and the temple was burned, and all the gold was melted, and it was dug up, and it was destroyed. There's no more old covenant, and that was the sign of it. And that was the sign of his coming. He came to put an end to the old covenant, that now we can live in the new covenant, in the new heavens and earth. Okay? That's going to be a big one, that we're in the new heavens and earth. But remember, Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world, right? He rejected an earthly kingdom. They tried to make him an earthly king, and he rejected it, and they killed him. He said, the kingdom does not come with observation. You won't look over there and say, there it is, or here and say, here it is, because the kingdom is within you. That's what I'm arguing. The kingdom is within us. We are living in the new heavens and earth. And Jesus wasn't confused, and the disciples weren't confused. He fulfilled every single thing that he said that he would do, exactly when, in that generation, that he said he would do it. And the great thing about that is we are not living in the end times, okay? You don't have to live in fear of that. That was judgment on Old Covenant Israel. It's done. It's gone. It's over. And we are dwelling in the new covenant, where we're no longer slaves to the law, where we're at peace with God. We've entered into this new promised land. It's not a physical promised land, you know? I mean, remember what happened 40 years after the Israelites entered the wilderness and they wandered? What happened? They finally entered the promised land, and they walked around the city of Jericho 7 times, and they blew the trumpets, and the walls came down. Okay, that is a perfect typological picture of what happened in the first century. Okay, the walls of Jerusalem came tumbling down, and that was the sign that they had entered into the promised land, that we get to enter into this promised land, but it's not physical. And why would we want it to be? I mean, ask yourself that. What in the Bible, when is the physical ever superior to the spiritual? Remember, we're going to worship him in the new kingdom in spirit and in truth. So, I know that's a lot. Oh my gosh, 40 minutes.